Welcome to the DRF Sports Podcast, brought to you by DRF Sports. America's most trusted name in horse racing is now providing sports bettors with exclusive data, analytics, previews, videos, and expert picks on all major sports. Bet smarter and have more fun doing it. It's the DRF Sports Podcast, and now your host, Sheldon Alexander. Ready, set, bet.
This is the DRF Sports Podcast, episode 58. Don't forget to like and follow wherever you get your podcast. I'm your host, Sheldon Alexander. The madness continues as the Sweet 16 is ready to get underway this Thursday. And of course, we'll break all of that down each and every single game, giving you some picks. But first, be a pro and win with DRF Sports Pro, introducing DRF Sports' all-new premium data feature on drf.com/sports. For $99 a year, which is just $8.25 a month, you can get industry-leading bets, trends, angles, and analytics. With the madness here, it's the best way for you to make some money and have fun while doing it. That's DRF Sports Pro. Sign up now at drf.com/sports. And hopefully, as always, we can keep our pro picks here going well on the pod. 16 teams left, which means 8 games for us to try and find the value and win some money. And for that deep dive, had to bring back our guy, Mr. Matt Russell, to break things down. And luckily for y'all, it starts right about now. Well, it's almost like we're all going through a little bit of withdrawal here as we go from the high of wall-to-wall college basketball action to a couple days without it. It seems so strange. But as we look towards Thursday, we know the Sweet 16 is here, which means there's more games for us to bet on. And to do that, here's my guy, Mr. Matt Russell, once again to deep dive into the game-by-game action of the Sweet 16. Mr. Matt Russell, how you doing?
I'm good. I'm keeping it together. I made the mistake. Well, it's not a mistake necessarily. Early on in the week, NIT lines came out, and I bet on 2 games, and I was all excited. I was like, okay, Tuesday night, we're back. You know, maybe it's not the NCAA tournament. We got a little NIT action, and then I realized both games that I bet on were on Wednesday night, and so I had to wait one extra day for that, and I missed, well, quote unquote missed quite the sweat last night in the NIT when the last 7 seconds of Xavier and Vanderbilt lasted 20 plus minutes with back to back. They were literally trading timeouts at one point. There was multiple reviews and a series of fouls as well. And the game landed, I believe the line was 2.5 and the game landed on 2. So it was quite the sweat for bettors out there. Not for me. I'm playing, what do I have tonight? I have Washington State plus 3.5 tonight, and I have Texas A&M minus 2.5 tonight in the NIT. So doing my best to hold off the full scale withdrawals when it comes to basketball. And of course, the women's tournament, watched a handful of that on Monday as well. Man, when you talk home court advantage, apparently women's basketball, or at least this season, meaningless because you've got good teams losing at home. We should be sprinkling the money line on some of these underdogs, but we missed our opportunity. Who knew?
We'll make those notes for next year on the must-see TV outside of the madness. But speaking of said madness, let's get things going with the first matchup here. We got number 4 Arkansas versus number 1 Gonzaga. Gonzaga 9, and I'm seeing it up to 9.5 at this point. I feel like that's too many points just because of the way that Gonzaga's been playing so far. Yes, they're able to pull away in the second halves. I think they've been doing all right, but I just see it being a little bit of a slower pace here, and Arkansas being able to maybe keep it a little close. I'm not confident in it, but if I'm picking a side, which I force myself to do, I'm on Arkansas here.
Yeah, if you need action, I have Arkansas plus 1,800 to make the Final Four from much earlier on in the season, and that's all I really want to be involved in when it comes to this game. Not that I even think Arkansas has much of a chance to win this game. My number is 8.5, so and the market has been inflated on Gonzaga all season long. So I'm not surprised that this went up to 9.5, because that would be more in line with how these teams have been rated all season. So there's nothing really that I'm dying to play here. As much as I have the Arkansas ticket, it's hard for me to imagine a universe where they beat Gonzaga. right? Especially, and you talk about, the way that Gonzaga's played, certainly in the first halves, and maybe that's some sort of an angle, right? Maybe take Arkansas in the first half, maybe a first half money line. I don't know, something like that, where it's going to be not an outlier performance, but a trend that you're sort of, able to play off of, that's going to pay out at a decent price, probably I think in the plus 250 type of a range here for Arkansas money line in the first half. That would be just enough to tease me in my 1800 plus 1800 ticket, in the same way that it did with my Memphis 50-1 to win the region as well. But we're talking about covering here, and so Arkansas might have looked as bad as anyone. Again, like I said, you mentioned Gonzaga struggling a little bit. Arkansas, man, like that was ugly in those first two games, and they edged Vermont and New Mexico State in, the least exciting way possible. But here's the thing, and you don't often, I don't want to use the phrase "they're due," because that's absolutely the laziest thing in the history of all like sports betting and sports handicapping. But when it comes to college kids, man, you remember, like, is any day back to back the same for you or for anybody that you knew? So this is an Arkansas team that, if you look at them season long, and, listen, the SEC's taken a bit of a hit reputation wise in this tournament, but it certainly felt like they were a pretty good basketball team. And it didn't look like they were a very good basketball team this past weekend. You changed the locations. We'll talk about this with some of these other matchups, but you change the locations, and like, I kind of expect the opposite for a lot of these teams the very next weekend. And Arkansas might be one of those teams, right? Maybe it's oh man, we survived. Like, that was close type of a situation. They have the experience, both from a coaching standpoint and from a player standpoint, last year having a nice little run. I believe it was to the regional final, right? Against Baylor, where they ended up getting hammered. But guess what? Everybody got hammered by Baylor. So, I expect a lot better out of Arkansas. Here's the thing. Are we going to get, I'm going to call it the Duke factor, because we're going to talk about it with regards to the next game in the West region. Is Gonzaga going to get this Duke factor situation, right? Because Memphis's front court that on paper could handle Gonzaga, they ended up getting fouled out, right? It was just fouls hand over fist there. Is Arkansas going to get the same treatment? Are they going to get fouled out? And by the way, does Arkansas even have the guys to get fouled out? The best case for Arkansas might be that they just don't even have the front court to even get fouled out. And they might just end up, 4-guard lineup type situation here. They might just bomb threes and just hope for the best. But here's the problem. They have one guy who shoots better than 31% from the 3-point line, right? This is Alabama, because Alabama is a team that bombs threes, but it is Alabama in that Alabama has nobody who can shoot this season. But is it that strategy? And I mentioned Alabama because they are one of the few teams that beat Gonzaga this year by deploying that strategy. And I don't want to say kind of getting lucky, but when you look at Alabama's splits, they got lucky winning that game because they shot so well. So that's kind of Arkansas's only chance here, is to just kind of bomb away. Gonzaga got their scare in that first weekend. So I don't really have a ton here. The interesting thing to me, though, is I shouldn't say on what planet, but like, since when would you ever see the 9th highest rated defense go up against the 15th rated defense, and the total is 155? Like, that is up there for two teams that actually play pretty good defense, right? That 155 is like a Duke versus Michigan State type total, and I don't even think it was that high. I don't even think it was particularly even close to that. I think it was about 10 points lower. And so, like, I might be looking to play the under if I was looking to play anything, and that sort of allows me to kind of just keep my fingers crossed and hope Arkansas pulls something out. I feel this is sort of an 80-65 type game, though, with Gonzaga kind of pulling away, obviously, throughout the second half, as they have done, because again, Arkansas offensively, I don't see them being able to have a ton of success, and defensively, it's not a very good matchup, in my opinion, for them. And so I understand why this has gone up, both from a matchup standpoint and from a market standpoint. So it's not something I'm dying to play. And when Gonzaga gets going, and why is it 155? Well, both these teams play at a pretty high pace. Obviously, Gonzaga, one of the top tempo teams in the country. So, like, when there are more possessions, there are going to be more points. But maybe it's a situation where defensively both teams are able to show up, play to their capabilities, and keep this under the number of 155. So I'll wait, see if it goes up any more here. But maybe I'll put a small bet on the under. And again, keep my fingers crossed that Arkansas can pull off the victory. But I fully expect Gonzaga to handle them relatively easily in this first game on Thursday.
Yeah, I love it. And as I mentioned, I don't really believe in Arkansas, but it is my vow to start fading Gonzaga anytime they start playing real teams from real conferences. And that trend in March Madness will continue. Let's move on to the 11th seeded Michigan versus number 2 Villanova. Villanova favored by 5 points in this game. And Juwan Howard and company, I feel as if like they've already had their chip, but at the end of the day, you know, that's a pretty solid number. That's a lot of points there. And I feel like this game should be able to be close. So I actually like Michigan plus the points here. How do you see this?
So it's hard for me to disagree with that sort of offhand. I just have a hard time believing that this version of Michigan is actually good, right? And that's part of, you know, you watch the season and you're sitting there and listen, there's very few games where Michigan was better than expected on a given day, right? They might have covered a couple of games here and there, obviously, but there was very few where it was like, yep, this is this Michigan version that can go on a run here. And obviously Jones, the point guard, like that's a situation, right, where, you know, he doesn't play because he's got a concussion. They try to let him play and it doesn't go particularly well. Kind of a scary situation, if you're asking me, where a player can be sort of greenlit to play and he gets out and he runs around for 5 minutes and all of a sudden it's like, nope, this isn't going to work. Like that's a little bit dicey. So I'm finding it hard to believe that this version with him out and kind of in general is all that good. You know, I look at this Tennessee game that they just played, and that's the one where at 7.5 point underdogs. And listen, I can't believe I wasn't just absolutely hammering plus 7.5 in that game. I didn't have a bet on the side or total in that game, especially with Rick Barnes' involvement. The Vols got to the rim so easily. And I think that's an indicator of problems on a defense, right? And Tennessee shot 2 of 18 from 3. So when you look at that game, and by the way, Tennessee had the lead for the vast majority of that game, despite the fact that they couldn't shoot. And listen, man, you know, at this point, whether I don't want to brush the entire sport with this, you know, with this brushstroke, but like it kind of just matters whether you hit your threes or not in basketball, certainly in college basketball. And if you're going to go 2 of 18 while Hunter Dickinson himself goes 3 of 5, right? When the 7-foot center is stepping out for Michigan and canning trays at a 60% level, hitting more than your team, like you're going to be in trouble if you're Tennessee. And it took them, 37 minutes to essentially blow that lead. I just don't see that being the case for a Villanova team that prides itself on its shooting, that runs good offense, that has guard play that's going to be able to get to the rim in as an efficient way as Tennessee's guards were able to. So I just look at this and I go, man, like that's kind of a quote unquote lucky performance for Michigan. And the defense, it's funny, they have a okay rating, right? They're still in the top 100. That's not great. You'd like at this point a team to be in the top 20 defensively, but they face the toughest schedule of opposing offenses this season, right? Their ordinal is literally 1 next to that. But what that does is sometimes it gives you more credit for kind of just doing okay, right? It's like a degree of difficulty type thing, right? Pick your favorite degree of difficulty sport. I know you're a big figure skating guy. We talked about that in the Olympics podcast. You love it. I'll use diving for an example, right? You do a really tricky dive and it's only okay. Like you're going to get a decent score because you tried a tricky dive. It's the same thing with Michigan's defense this season. They've played a tough schedule of offenses. So just not giving up 100 points becomes a little bit more impressive. So I actually think the defense might be worse than the sort of 80 to 90 range in the country that they are, especially when I'm eye testing it and I'm watching that, they're not necessarily protecting the rim. They are giving up 3-pointers. They obviously had a good plan for Vescovi against Tennessee, but like Villanova is the type of team that a bunch of different guys are going to be able to beat you, right? Because they create that open shot. They play kind of like a mid-major where you and I talk about just creating open shots, only they have the talent of a, major program, right? And obviously, there's a massive coaching discrepancy here, potentially between Jay Wright and Juwan Howard. Again, but it's Michigan, and they're going to sort of kind of muck it up a little bit as far as like this game's concerned. They're going to get points where you don't really see them coming. But here's the key at this number. And I have this number -4, right? So I think there's actually a little bit of value on a technical basis on Michigan. But I grabbed Villanova -4.5 at -115. I think every point is going to matter, and here's why. The Wildcats are vying right now to be the best free throw shooting team in the history of college basketball. They're shooting like 82.7%, something along those lines, from the free throw line. And so the points sort of matter a little bit less in this game, because if this is a 2-point game late, then we get to the free throw type situation in that last 30 seconds. There's a higher probability that Villanova is going to win this game by 5, 6, 7 points than sort of any other random team. You know what I mean? So like it could be 2 points the entire game, and then all of a sudden it goes to 6, it goes to 8 because a couple of missed shots by Michigan and free throws get converted by Villanova because there is a better chance they convert those free throws. So I think this line might be inflated because of that. Like that's why it's not 4, it's 4.5 or 5, because of the free throws at the end. Wouldn't be a big deal if it was a pick 'em. Right? Wouldn't be a big deal if this was -10, but because it's in that sweet spot where free throws are going to be the difference a lot of the time, when we're talking about the probabilities, we talk more about it in football when you're getting a half point on the other side of 7 or something along those lines. This is kind of that, where you're getting not the half point necessarily, you're getting the better team in the last 30 seconds. We always talk about, hey, you're betting on what happens in the first 39 minutes. And in the first 39 minutes, +5 probably sounds like a pretty good idea on Michigan. But because that last minute skews the percentages of win probability against the point spread, against this type of point spread, then I'm going to play Villanova. It's not going to be some massive crazy bet, but this is a bet, single solitary bet for me at -4.5, because one book had it up at -4.5 for -115. I'll pay that extra 5 cents, so to speak, to get that half point in a key area when it comes to how good Villanova's free throw shooting is. Listen, I faded Villanova against Ohio State. The Buckeyes had a bad break with Kyle Young, speaking of concussions, right? Sort of re-aggravating potentially that concussion. That was a key element. But even then, that team was within 2-3 points when Kyle Young was out. What was the issue? Couldn't make a shot towards the end. Villanova hit all their free throws. A 2 or a 3 point game becomes a 10-point game in that situation, right? I think that same sort of thing is possible here. Obviously, the point guard situation for Michigan is a problem as well. So with those two things kind of in conjunction, I like Villanova to win. And therefore, because of their ability to close, I like them to cover here at -4.5 or -5. But if it lands on 5 and you push, not a huge deal. Obviously, a little bit disappointing, but certainly worth a bet, in my opinion.
I'm just most interested to see whether at the end of the game, Juwan Howard is going to be pushing opponents or hugging opponents. Where's the line on that?
You never know. And by the way, if you like Michigan, I'm not going to talk you off of it. You might as well hit the money line with it, I think, right?
Sure.
Because I think there's just, if you like them, again, the only way you lose is, I shouldn't say the only way you lose, but the only way it matters is if this is sort of a last shot type of a game, right? Where Villanova wins it at the buzzer by 2 or 3 points, right? Because like I said, otherwise you're probably in trouble using that +5 because they're going to cover this game a lot of the time at the free throw line.
Yeah. And as we move on to number 3, Texas Tech versus number 2, Duke, in a pick'em game as Coach K's farewell tour continues. And I got to be honest here, for a lot of different reasons, I'm on Texas Tech. And I know that the whole world, the refereeing world, the NCAA commissioners, and that whole room of old white guys that put together the bracket, like all of them will be rooting for Duke to go through and keep it moving. But this line is mega fishy to me because I feel like the whole world would be sitting here betting on Duke. And yet that's not what the line is telling me. So I'm just based off those things. I'm going with Texas Tech here. What say you?
They don't make movies like they used to, Shal. they don't make movies like they used to. You and I, of a certain age, we grew up in the 90s, late 90s, I'll say, just to give us, maybe trick some people into thinking we're a little bit younger. Um, and honestly, if you're younger than we are, go back and grab a list of movies from the late 90s, like dramas, that sort of thing. And you'll be surprised what you can come up with. And one of these movies that sort of has fallen under the radar is a movie called Primal Fear. And that's a movie starring Richard Gere and Edward Norton, sort of Edward Norton's kind of coming out party, if you will, as far as getting on people's radars as a really incredible dramatic actor. And the movie Primal Fear is a kind of, that's titled appropriately. Richard Gere plays a lawyer who is charged with defending Edward Norton, who is charged with a murder. And this sort of primal fear is that Edward Norton, in fact, committed the murder. But he plays this character that is very sort of shy, and you're like, how could this kid, do this murder, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so, I don't want to spoil it for anybody necessarily, but the whole movie is based on this concept of we kind of know what is going to happen here because of what the primal fear is. Well, when it comes to Duke and Texas Tech, you and I know what our primal fear is. This is the thing that we have seen coming since before the bracket came out. And certainly when the bracket came out, what did I say? I was like, I'm already pre-angry about how this is going to end, right? This is going to end with me with a bet on Texas Tech. I just said at the time, probably have a couple of points here. That's not the case. And honestly, I don't think this number is wrong. So when you say sort of fishy, I push back on that a little bit because I have Texas Tech as a half-point favorite. The market, based on the point spreads throughout the season, would have it at about a pick 'em. So I was a little bit, again, tiny amount surprised. You can literally measure your level of surprise when this opened Texas Tech -1, -1.5 area, because it was about a half point too big. Right. And so that's not a ton, especially in that area. This is different than the Villanova Michigan game where the pick 'em to -1 probably isn't going to come, into fruition here as anything sort of big. So what were we worried about? We're going to be worried about how the game will be officiated, right? The Gonzaga Duke game is the inevitability. And so you're sitting here going, all right, am I going to push up against this inevitability, push up against our primal fear? Or are we going to lean into it? And the answer is kind of both, actually, right? And so the people who are saying, hey, man, okay, I get the reference and all of that sort of thing, but, you don't really think these games are fixed in any kind of a way. And I would say, no, not really, but the committee didn't have to put Duke as the 2 seed in the West. Right? That wasn't some qualification where if you finish first in the ACC, you go to the West to be in the 2nd seed. It's no, like you said, a bunch of people in a committee stood around for multiple days and were like, it'd be cool. Gonzaga Duke in the regional final. They did. And you can't tell me that, oh man, they just accidentally, I guess they would face each other if they were in this regional final. This is a group that 3 weeks earlier put out their 4 seeds in each region as sort of a preview. So they're already thinking in terms of the top 4 seeds, i.e. who would play each other in the Sweet 16, who would play each other in the regional final. And I would throw you one more here, Shell. They didn't need to put Texas Tech as the 3 seed in the West either. But where does Texas Tech rate in the hierarchy of college basketball from a blue blood program type of a thing? Not particularly high, unfortunately, for Texas Tech. We just watched Chris Beard leave Texas Tech to go to Texas. If this was Texas, they wouldn't have gotten thrown to the Wolves, right? Purdue didn't get thrown to the Wolves here, right? Texas Tech got thrown to the Wolves. Villanova didn't get thrown to the Wolves. Tennessee didn't get thrown to the Wolves. Not even Wisconsin got thrown to the Wolves, so to speak. Texas Tech is a team that, in the NCAA committee's opinion, is disposable. And they've already gotten their Final Four appearance, so who cares? Not a big deal. They're going to screw them here some way, whether it's just putting them in the group with Duke and Gonzaga or actually doing it on the court. Now, again, all of that is primal fear, conspiracy, the thing that we're worried about. We don't know if that's going to be the case because, by the way, Texas Tech might play so well that none of this matters, that they overcome the quote unquote 5-on-8, right? That type of thing. And so I look at this and I go, okay, how is this game going to look if we are the Richard Gere, in this situation? What are we going to have to look for to find out whether or not Edward Norton, i.e. this basketball game, is the killer? Well, it's going to be Texas Tech up early, right? Duke starts getting some calls, and a game that, you always watch these basketball games and it goes like, man, feels like this team should be up 12 or 15. Like, feels like this should be a big time blowout or a big lead. And you look up and it's like 8, right? And then Duke hits a 3 and it's down to 5. And you're like, how is this a 5-point game? Like, Texas Tech is all over them. It's dunks, it's defensive plays, right? Blocks, steals, all of this sort of thing. And you look up and you're like, how did we get here? And so those calls start to add up, right? The fouls start to add up. Maybe the Duke gets into the bonus early, right? And it's sort of innocuous because the sketchy foul calls are touch fouls, arm bars, that kind of thing. It isn't blatant, right? And maybe a couple of calls that don't go Texas Tech's way turn into, obviously defensive stops for Duke. And it starts to add up. I look at this as something where Duke Live makes a ton of sense to me. Once and again, we'll put it in sort of the sketchiest way possible here. Once the fix is in, that's when you want to play Duke, because if Duke just runs off with it and they are the better team, because let's be honest, these are two evenly matched teams. They could both just run away with this game in theory. I happen to think that Texas Tech has the better chance. If you told me one of these teams wins by 15 points, I would guess it would be Texas Tech. When Duke loses in the tournament, it's often with a bang. It is often with a flourish. It is often a relatively convincing win for the other team. You think of South Carolina, you think of Oregon, those sorts of games where they get to the Sweet 16 and it's over, right? They win tight a lot of the time. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to play this in a very specific way. I'm going to start with the Red Raiders at Pick'em. I'm going to make that bet for a single unit, because if they are the better team, and if nothing that anybody can do to influence the outcome of this game can influence it because they are just that good, then Texas Tech's just going to win the game. They're just going to win this game relatively comfortably. However, what I'm also going to do is I'm going to look for a spot to bet Duke, and I'm going to look for a spot to bet Duke, and hopefully if you can parlay things live, Duke and the over, Duke or the over, Duke and the over separately, anything along those lines, I think works, because you're going to have to, and what we're going to have to look for here is obviously those fouls starting to creep up, right? That's the number that I'm going to be watching in this game outside of the score. Okay, that's up to 5. You're up to 5 fouls in the first 5 minutes, in the first 7 minutes, something along those lines, where you go, man, there's a very good chance Duke's going to shoot free throws here for the last 8 minutes of the first half, something along those lines. So if we're sitting there with a Texas Tech bet and Duke just takes the lead, then we're just going to be hoping Texas Tech makes a comeback and wins the game. If we're not, then we're going to sort of try to middle this thing here. We're going to look for a +4.5, a +5.5, something along those lines with Duke to take some of the edge off of our Texas Tech bet, thinking that, okay, man, like this game should be out of hand, but it's not, like that type of a situation. So we're going to start with the Red Raiders, make that bet when you can. I would wait until tip off, because you can see the Duke money starting to pile up here a little bit. Not in any sort of massive way, but they're going to be the favorite amongst the betting community, and that's going to move the line. I could see this even closing Duke -1 by the time tip-off hits. But if it doesn't, pick them, that's fine, right? But it's just worth waiting to see if you can get the best price. And then again, if the defense overwhelms, okay, that's fine. We're good to go with a Raiders wire-to-wire win here. But if it's close, find the spot to get points. Since Texas Tech can go dry on offense, right? They're shooting, their offense isn't particularly great. They can go a 5-minute period with nobody else's help, right? They can go a 5-minute period without scoring. And so Duke might not win this game, but they're going to be given every opportunity to win this game to set up the Gonzaga-Duke matchup in the regional final.
It's going to be a great game either way, because it's going to be just drama, despite whatever the outcome ends up being. But another great game as well will be number 5 Houston versus number 1 Arizona. Arizona favored by 2 in this game. And I look at this and I just think, it's Houston. We talked about Houston from the start of the bracket season. I'll call it, and looked at this matchup as a potential upset, a potential way for you to win your bracket. And we're here. So I'm still going to be on Houston, and you're going to give me a couple points. Why not?
Yeah. Well, in the bracket contest, right? Like we talked about this is one of our sort of framework picks. And man, I'm looking at the bracket right now. And we did this show on Monday morning, and, we're sort of living in the throes of what happened from a betting standpoint, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm looking at the bracket and I'm just like, man, what an opportunity lost here, right? Because between North Carolina, we had them going through into the Sweet 16, and that's something of a difference maker. Iowa State coming through into the Sweet 16, that's something of a difference maker. And there's a couple here, obviously, that is like, man, we should have known better. Villanova, Michigan, for example, as a something that was a little bit chalkier. But I just look and I go, man, outside of the USC Miami discussion and the Kentucky just gashing the whole thing, if either of those two games, USC and Miami, if USC wins that game, because again, I'll go to my grave saying that Auburn was going to lose that second round game to whomever they played, either one of those teams, or if stupid Kentucky had one, maybe the worst upset, certainly in school history, maybe in tournament history, like I would have a fun time sort of debating that. If either of those things go through, I'm sitting pretty, man. I'm loving my bracket, but those two things don't happen. And that's the sort of knife's edge that you're on because of how 50-50 a lot of these games are. And so the point is, you mentioned this is a situation where it's like, oh man, if two teams are kind of rated equal, like take the +2. When it comes to bracket contests, the final numbers on ESPN's Who Picked Whom on their tournament challenge, 67% of the population have Arizona winning this game. 14% have Houston winning this game. Obviously, the leftover percent being the chances of Illinois or UAB or one of these other teams, right, getting through, because obviously the bracket gets put out before the tournament starts. But you're sitting there and you're sitting, for those poker, enthusiasts out there, that's at like what, 5-1, right? You're getting 5-1 on your money, so to speak, here on a game that you're a 2-point underdog. So again, when we talk about this and we do our best to project it, I think we talked about how Arizona would be a small favorite, and maybe people thought, 4 or 5 points, something like that. I think we quoted 2 points because this, again, is very in line with where the market numbers are. Actually, Arizona's a little bit inflated here, which is going to cause me to bet on Houston. One, because I don't have this implicit value because my bracket's dead. But two, because getting 2 points with Houston, that Houston team that nobody seemed to have any sort of credit for, as they were talking about UAB as a team that could possibly upset this team. And then it takes like a weekend of people actually watching Houston. I understand why I don't watch Houston. Houston's a tough team to watch, literally, because it's hard to find their games. They're always sort of an ESPN2 afterthought when there's a big time Big Ten or SEC game on ESPN proper. Like, people aren't going to watch the 15-point beatdown that Houston's going to lay on like Central Florida on a Wednesday night, right? They're not going to get locked into the American Conference tournament because, again, it's Houston beatdown, and then a game against Memphis, right? And even then, it competes against a quote unquote better game with the SEC tournament going on or the Big Ten tournament going on, the championship game going on. But then you watch them for 2 days and you're like, oh man, this Houston team is legit. And it's like, yeah, that's what we're trying to tell you. That's what the metrics are trying to tell you. So now we've paired the metrics of this team that is literally ranked second in the country right now on KenPom with the eye test of watching them just adult UAB and Illinois in back-to-back games. And then you compare it with Arizona playing against TCU, a team that is also an adult, like the Horned Frogs. And that big, again, it's the Big 12. Like, this is a legit conference that plays man basketball every single night. And you go, man, it was really rough for Arizona against TCU. That is an adult team, but also isn't remotely as talented as Houston. And so the thing to remind yourselves going forward comes to the bracket thing, obviously strategy, but also that your seed is your resume in these tournaments. The seed is not your talent. The seed is not the quality of the team. So when a team is the 5th seeded team, it's based on what they did resume wise. And we can hype the metrics all we want, but the resume didn't look particularly good for Houston because there wasn't a ton of opportunities for it to look good. Speaking of a team who could use an upgrade to, say, the Big 12, for example. And, so it's like, okay, well, if we're not rating these teams by the quality, then there's going to be opportunities here for quote unquote upsets. So from a basketball standpoint, okay, how does this upset happen with Houston? Well, to me, it's how many extra possessions is Houston going to create? Arizona's 5th in the country in tempo. Houston is 333rd in tempo. They are going to drag this game into the mud. And part of the reason why their tempo is such is because they have a lot of long offensive possessions, because they get offensive rebounds. When you're saying, well, okay, Arizona, they got a couple of big guys out there, they're going to give up these offensive rebounds. 20 offensive rebounds given up against TCU on Sunday. So they're just going to get that fixed. They're just going to get that figured out for Houston, the biggest offensive boarding team in the country, essentially, at least from a strategic standpoint. So I'm just looking at this and I go, okay, coaching matchup. Kelvin Sampson can slow this game down. I trust him to play this game, have this game played at the tempo and the way that he wants to have it played. I don't trust Tommy Lloyd at this point. There's a decent chance Tommy Lloyd is the greatest recruiter in the country, right? Scanning the globe for players for Mark Few at Gonzaga, and then immediately and impressively scanning the globe for players for Arizona and putting together this team that is super fun to watch and has everything you'd ever want from a team, right? Even when Kirk Karice is not shooting the ball well, it looks a lot better when he's on fire, because it's like, how do you beat this team? And by the way, how do you beat this team if Kirk Karice is shooting the ball well? Because you're pairing that with the big guys down low and Benedict Mathurin and all of the other guys, there's 8 guys on this team that can beat you. Problem is, you only can play 5 at a time. And so the decision is, okay, how much Kirk Karice are we going to play here? Are we going to let him shoot us out of the game if he's going to miss his first 5 threes, if he's going to have the performance that he had against UCLA on the road earlier this year where he couldn't make a shot? Or is he going to have the performance against UCLA at home earlier this year? Because I wrote about this a month ago when they were going to go play Colorado, and I predicted that Colorado was going to win that game outright. And so we grabbed the money line as a 10-point home underdog to Arizona, because the road schedule wasn't all that tough this year for Arizona, right? A lot of their reputation, if you will, was built on home games at the McHale Center. And that's a pretty great place to play, especially when things are rolling pretty well, because you can get pretty hyped and you can blow out some Pac-12 teams pretty quick. Now we find neutral site territory. And by the way, not even that neutral, because this game is being played in San Antonio, Texas. So Houston, in theory, is going to have at least a significant portion of the crowd. Who knows percentage-wise, but it's certainly not going to be a home game for Arizona. And so I'm trusting Kelvin Sampson here to slow this game down. I'm not trusting Tommy Lloyd, because if there's only going to be 64 possessions per team versus 72 possessions per team, and in that sort of tighter span of possessions, the possessions for Houston are going to be longer because of the offensive rebounds, the defense is going to get tired here for Arizona, right? That's how Houston plays. That's why the last 10 minutes against Illinois looked the way that it looked, right? Because Illinois was just like, I can't do this any longer. I did this for 30 minutes. I can't do much more. We hung in, we were tied with 10 minutes to go, something along those lines. And then it just kind of fell apart at the end. It didn't just kind of fell apart again at the end. This was by design for Houston. So can Arizona survive Kriisa missing? I don't really think they can. And are we expecting a guy like Koloko to start the game 9 for 9 or 10 for 10 the way that he did against TCU, which is the only thing, by the way, that kept Arizona in that game, is that they got whatever they wanted in the first half from Koloko. Not going to happen against Houston. It's just not going to happen. So I have this number, Houston -0.5, right? A lot of that obviously stemming from KenPom having them rated higher than Arizona in his ratings. And so to me, you're getting 2 free points. Now, is that going to matter? Who knows? Because like we said, the shooting is going to be the difference maker, right? Kriisa hits a bunch of threes. Mathurin hits some threes, the assortment of other guys, right? Tubulus can do that, whatever. I've had Houston in this game since before the tournament started. I'm getting 2 points that I think I don't necessarily deserve in this game, or money line. This is a game, by the way, that I don't see, if you lose the spread, or if you win the spread, it's not going to be because Houston won this game by a point, or Houston won this game by 2 if you found a 2.5, something along those lines. I think this is a game that if Houston's good enough and it goes their way, they win the game. So I'm going to grab plus 110 on the money line. I'm not even going to play the spread, I'm going to, from a value standpoint, it isn't that I'm getting 2 extra points. It's that I'm getting 20 extra cents. So instead of getting a minus 110 bet, I'm getting a plus 110 bet. And listen, if I was getting plus 110 bets on things that I thought should be minus 110 my whole life, I'd be a sports book, right? Because that's how they play. So I'm all over Houston. This is probably my biggest bet of the week here. This is the one that I'm willing to go down, sort of firing here, so to speak, as something that I've had targeted for a week plus now, and that I'm going to keep playing here, with reckless abandon, if you will.
Well, speaking of going down, there's a team that has refused to go down despite being a number 15 seed as we move on to Friday's games. And we're talking about St. Peter's. They will take on number 3 seed Purdue. Purdue favored by 12.5 points. And I get it. It's a lot of points. But I just refuse to believe that people actually know much about St. Peter's. So give me the points.
Okay. Fair. And man, do things take a steep fall from Thursday to Friday from a game quality standpoint. But again, that's what's going to happen when a 15 seed finds its way into the Sweet 16. But listen, there's a couple others here that aren't necessarily that, rated that badly, where the game could be relatively grim. Okay, so here's the situation here. Couple of different things here. One, there is reason to believe that minus 12.5 isn't high enough for Purdue. Based on, and you don't have to go that far back, right? Like Murray State was 8-point favorites, right? Kentucky was, I think, what they opened 15.5 and they went to 17.5, something along those lines, right? And would Kentucky be a 5-point favorite against Purdue? No, I think that would be closer to 3.5. So there actually might be a couple of points of value here on Purdue. Why? Because St. Peter's has played pretty well over the last couple of games, right? Obviously, and even going back into the Metro Atlantic Athletic Conference tournament. So that's why this number is starting to drop here a little bit. Now, because they have played so well, their metrics have gone up. And I'm not even really all that positive that Purdue has played all that well. I think their metrics actually may have gone a little bit down. So my number, just from the pure basketball metric standpoint, is actually a little bit lower than 12.5. So there's actually a pretty big disparity. And that's why this number's fallen in the middle, right? When, as much as I like it, so to speak, when my number lands exactly what my number is, or where there's a, very obvious reason why I'm getting value, it's also kind of fun to see, okay, market thinks this probably should be about 14 based on historical point spreads. I think this probably should be about 11, and it lands directly in the middle. So who am I going to go with here, right? I'm probably going to go with the market in this situation because I know what's gone into my number coming down, and that's St. Peter's beating Kentucky, playing pretty well, overcoming a shot quality disparity. But that's the thing that I can't shake. I can't shake that game was a fluke upon flukes. Now, again, they ended up beating Murray State. So that, obviously confirms that St. Peter's is not a fluke. But in that game, right, this is, different fork in the road, different path. There's a lot of different times, i.e. 98% of the time, where we never see St. Peter's play Murray State, and they never get that opportunity because they were supposed to win that game 2% of the time against Kentucky, which obviously, before, during, and after, outside of the scoreboard, makes a ton of sense, right? You are a 18-point underdog. You're probably expected to win that game about 2% of the time, right? Obviously the money line being 20-1, something along those lines. So I look at this game and I go, okay, from a number standpoint, I can see why it could be higher, but I also can see why the number is what it is. But then I go into the history of these types of teams with these upsets, the Florida Gulf Coasts of the world, right? The UMBCs of the world. Now, UMBC didn't even make the Sweet 16. They ended up getting blown out the very next day, the 2 days later, against Kansas State, right? a team that ended up going to, I believe, the Elite Eight that year, in part because they didn't have to face Virginia, a full strength Virginia in the second round. By the way, nobody, absolutely nobody talks about Virginia not playing that game with, playing that game without DeAndre Hunter that year, right? Everybody talks about that. Oh, 116 Virginia. Oh, fools. It's like, well, they didn't have their best player, right? Nobody ever talks about that. Small interjection. So I look at the history and I go, okay, these teams do get blown out, especially, if they ride the wave of that first weekend, right? And obviously they're playing Murray State, a team not as accomplished as Kentucky. It's kind of, I don't want to say easy, but it's kind of easy to ride that wave that weekend. Now they've gone home. They've had the celebration, right? Like there's practically been a parade in Jersey City at this point for this team. They've done all the media, the pats on the back. I talk about it all the time, college sports, right? And you get that pat on the back week, right? There's going to be a slip up on the other side. I don't think this team really thinks that they can win the national championship, right? I mean, maybe they do. Maybe they're completely deranged, but this matchup actually, I think, presents a bigger problem than the Kentucky matchup. And again, the Kentucky matchup produced a game that, from a shot quality standpoint, should have been about a 22-point Kentucky victory. Thing is with Kentucky is you've got Oscar Tshiebwe, who is an amazing player, but part of his amazingness is as an undersized 5, he's able to rebound 20 boards a game, basically, right? He's able to just get the ball wherever it's happening. But you can work your way around a guy like that. You can't work your way around Zach Edey and Travion Williams down in the post, right? And yes, St. Peter's has some okay post players, and I shouldn't say okay, that's not good enough. Very good post players, post defenders. But we're talking about some size, right? Some width in Travion Williams and some height and some width with Zach Edey. And by the way, that's not the only issue. The issue is the size on the perimeter as well. Who on St. Peter's is guarding Jaden Ivey? Because again, there's nobody on Kentucky that looks like Jaden Ivey, right? There are sort of pieces where you're like, okay, he's a couple inches shorter. Oh, this guy's pretty quick, right? Severe Wheeler, for all his quickness, right, doesn't provide a size mismatch. Even Ty Washington doesn't provide a size mismatch. Jaden Ivey, right, is has Ja Morant potential here. And you're sticking a size mismatch down low with that mismatch on the outside. And by the way, even the 2 and the 3 and the other guys out on Purdue are all bigger than St. Peter's. And so offensively, this is a team that's much better than Kentucky in Purdue. Defensively, they're not. But we've seen it start to ramp up here a little bit. In that Texas game, I was actually kind of impressed with Purdue's defense. Now, nobody wants to give them any credit, and I certainly don't want to give them much credit because they shot 46 free throws in that game. But Texas had absolutely no idea what to do on defense, which was actually a change of pace here for Purdue. And so I just go, okay, this is a St. Peter's team that the issue in whether they could even cover the spread against Kentucky was, could they generate enough offense? So it's kind of a bad matchup in that it's a bad offensive team going up against a bad defensive team that, by the way, defense, lots about effort, right? A lot of defense is about effort. Purdue seems to sort of decided to turn it on at this point in the season here. They've got a few more games. Maybe that, maybe it's Ivy. Maybe Ivy's more interested in playing defense. Maybe it's less Stevanovic out there, right? Because you've seen different sort of designated shooters, if you will, playing instead of Stevanovic. I just look at this and I go, this is all great, the story, but how many times do we get sort of sucked into getting all of the points with the Cinderella story, and then we look up and it's 25-10 in the first half, and you go, okay, we might cover this game, but we're going to be hanging on for dear life here for the next 30 minutes and trying to win the next 30 minutes, and it might not necessarily work out. It's a dicey thing here because this could be a blowout game. This could be a game that's 18 points for, through 38 minutes, 39 minutes. And in the end, maybe St. Peter's makes a couple shots and Purdue could care less because, it's an 11 or 12 point victory. I'm going to make a bet on Purdue here. I think they absolutely overwhelm this St. Peter's team that has accomplished anything they possibly could have dreamed of from an accomplishment standpoint, and nothing can take that away from them. I think we're going to see Shaheen Holloway, headed straight to Seton Hall after this game, which is, that sort of disappointing element where we're probably never going to see St. Peter's again, if we're being completely truthful. it's just one of those things that we see it every year and we forget about it. And it's like, have you heard of Florida Gulf Coast, since Andy Enfield went to USC? No, you haven't. And it's just one of these teams. UMBC, just lost by 40 to Vermont in their conference tournament final. The world goes back on its axis, right? And so it got tilted a little bit when St. Peter's beat Kentucky and obviously pulled off that win against Murray State. More power to them. Purdue's just going to be too much here.
Fair enough. The next matchup where point spread's kind of getting up there, but it's still only at 7.5, is you have Kansas, who are favored against Providence. And Providence has been an interesting team to look at so far. And I mean, a lot of discussion about what kind of team Providence is, but I feel like I kind of know who Kansas is, and it's tough, but I will lay the 7.5 points here.
Okay. I don't begrudge you that. I don't know that I'm necessarily going to have a bet on this. I would certainly love it if Kansas comfortably won this game. My first and not only, but my only future bet from before the season or amongst the season starting, watching the Champions Classic in that first week was on Kansas at 20-1 to win the national title. I was like, we're not getting better. We're not getting better than this on this Kansas team. They have all the pieces. So let's just grab some 20-1 and sort of see what happens, right? And of course, you add to that, obviously, a couple months before the tournament, we do all this stuff. We're going to talk about Arkansas Final Four, all of that stuff. And you're like, yeah, the best bet the entire time was the bet I made back in November, right? And it's like, man, why do I bother with some of this other stuff that's all just kind of going red as the Kentuckys of the world get upset? Now, maybe Kansas gets upset here. It's funny, people talk about Bill Self as this guy who's like, can't handle his business as if he did not make a Final Four 3 years ago when they lost to an incredibly stacked Villanova team. Obviously, I'm a little bit frightened by Providence, right? Like this is, when you have that ordinal, that number one ordinal under the luck category, which of course everyone has made everything out of at this point. But these point spreads based on the metrics have always been fair to Providence, right? And 7.5 is a fair number as well. I will say that both of these teams, though, from like an inherent style, resultsy type of a way, it does feel like this is going to be a little bit closer. Because Kansas was a team all throughout the Big 12 that, they'd win a ton of games, but there was a lot of highly lined games that came down to, a bucket, maybe some overtime, right? You'll recall that overtime game before the Coach K parade towards the end of the season. That wasn't an unusual type of a result for Kansas, where they were 6-point favorites finding themselves in overtime or finding themselves in a last shot type of situation. Even as 7, 8, 9, 10-point favorites, that was the case a lot of the time as well. Meanwhile, you have this Providence team that's tough to figure out, 5 guys scoring basically in double digits. So it's hard to know what to expect, because beyond the luck, it's just sort of like, and I don't know that the luck element is built into this, but it's like, okay, we don't love anybody. There isn't one guy with like a cool nickname or anything on this team where you're like, oh man, like that's the guy who's going to get the bucket in the end. But if every one of them is going to sort of produce to a certain level and be really consistent, you are going to find yourself in a lot of close games. And the luck element stems from when Providence was winning those close games, right? Like that's what they got credit for. They got credit for winning close games. And there was some times where they got blown out. Creighton, and I think Creighton twice, if I'm not mistaken. I just look at this and I go, man, I don't know that I'm that comfortable laying points with Kansas. I faded them. I found the middle against Creighton, right? But Creighton got to a 13-point spread this past weekend because Ryan Kalkbrenner was out. And it was like, okay, we're going that far to a plus 13. Like that was a classic injury overreaction. So I knew that I could probably find the middle in between Kansas advancing and Creighton covering 13. Obviously 7.5 is a lot trickier for me in this situation. The one thing that I would maybe do is I think if Providence competes in this game from a point spread standpoint, I think the game kind of has to go over, because the number's 141 right now. And Kansas has to defend in order to cover that number, right? We talk about whether it's football or basketball. In order to cover a big point spread, it's not the offense that needs to be awesome. The defense is what needs to be awesome. The defense needs to allow the offense to be able to extend the lead. Kansas's defense, not that awesome, right? We just talked about Creighton without Kalkbrenner being able to score just enough against Kansas. So if Providence is able to score just enough, then I think the game has to go over, because I think Kansas does score against Providence, right? I think they score a ton, actually. And so I think this game sort of gets to a point where both teams are scoring, and we end up looking at something that's 75-70, 79-70, you know what I mean? Something along those lines, where if we're going to be sweating maybe free throws at the end of the game, right, that last minute or so, I'd rather be sweating it at like plus 300 with a parlay of those two, with a correlated parlay of the over in Providence versus just Providence, right? Now, again, if you think that Kansas defends and that Providence can't keep up offensively, and that, listen, as much as we give them credit for winning 2 games and getting to the Sweet 16, super tired Richmond and South Dakota State, who is in the tournament basically every year and never does anything, right? Like, let's temper our enthusiasm when it comes to Providence. Now, those 2 games being relatively easy, I mean, that's what you want if you're Providence. That's what you want when you go into a tournament's next round. You don't want to be exhausted because you played these like rough games. Like, both those games are all, you know, basically over or close to it with 10 or 5 minutes to go. So again, if there's a way to play it, I think it's Providence plus 7.5 correlated to the over. Throw those together in a parlay and sweat those, because I don't think those are, they're going to be priced like a parlay should be priced, but they're not, the win probability isn't going to be that, right? So if it's priced like a 25% outcome, I think the outcome's closer to like 40% in that situation. Whereas with this number at 7.5, honestly, I think it's 50-50 on either side.
I got you. What about North Carolina, the 8 seed? They take on UCLA, the 4 seed. UCLA favored by 2.5 points here. I look at this line in North Carolina. We wondered what kind of vibe they would be on heading into the tournament after coming out with some big wins, and they've been kind of rolling. Whereas UCLA, they've been looking okay. They've been looking all right. And this is an interesting matchup. But at the 2.5 points, I mean, I was ready to just take UCLA in this, but the way that North Carolina is rolling, it's making me really think about taking the 2.5 points here.
Yeah, it's scary, right? But like, isn't that UCLA where it's like, they looked all right. They got it done. Like, I'm not really sure that like they're awesome, but like they won the game, and like Mick Cronin like is still looking angry even though they won the game, and you're just sort of going like, man, this team's kind of weird, and we've experienced this team for 2 years now, right? Like, they've been on our radar for that long of a time. Couple of things here. So one, obviously the big thing is Jaime Jaquez's injury, who I'm always mixing up with Johnny Juzang, because they both have JJ names, and they both play basically the same kind of style where they're somehow making 2-pointers from a step inside of the 3-point line, and you're sort of just going like, why didn't you just take a step back? But the bucket went in, so nobody cares. First of all, like, yes, is Jaquez going to play? They talk about how he's, didn't practice yesterday, and people are taking videos of him like getting on and off the bus and walking around. Is he like, oh, is he ginger? Like, yeah, he's walking a little gingerly, and he didn't practice, but like they say he's going to play. And it helps, obviously, that they're playing the late game on Friday. The thing is, to me, like, it matters what the price is, or I shouldn't say it matters, but it's interesting to me what the price is going to be, because this line fell down to around UCLA, like -1 with a little extra juice, but like more of a flat -1.5, because early in the week, people go like, oh, Jaquez, might not play. So the line comes down a little bit. Then it starts to circulate that Cronin saying, oh, he's going to have 2 broken legs for him not to play. So the line starts moving up. And now we've got it at 2.5 now. And you start to feel like, oh man, maybe I missed the boat when it comes to the best of the number. And like, yes, that is technically the case. But if that number is -1.5 and Jaquez isn't playing, then like, what did you really miss? Versus, okay, if he is playing and he's fully healthy, what should the number be? My season-long market number, and keep in mind, this is a season of people not having a ton of respect for North Carolina. This is a season where they were 11-point underdogs on the road to Duke, which like again, these are the bets, right? That when we look back, we go, how did we not just absolutely house North Carolina plus 11 just on value alone? These are the things that if we were incredibly selective in our betting, we would have just bet that game that week and done nothing else because that was the best value on the board. So my season long number being 5 for UCLA shouldn't be all that surprising, but it also shouldn't be taken, with any level of gospel because we didn't think that much of North Carolina. My true number, my sort of metric induced number here is 3. So you're still getting a little bit of value at 2.5. And why are you getting a little value at 2.5? Because Jacquez is questionable, right? So again, it's if he plays and, you see him on the court in warmups and he's running around, I expect this number to go closer to what my fair number is, which is 3, or even through that. We talked about with Purdue, sort of something in the middle. I wouldn't be stunned if it went to 4 with a fully healthy Jaime Jaquez. So from a number standpoint, we should still be getting it while it's hot when it comes to UCLA minus 2.5. If you can get a -2, absolutely grab that. From an on-court basketball standpoint, right? North Carolina in those first 2 games, right? They wiped the floor with Marquette. And then until things got mega weird with, ejections and weird calls and Baylor showing heart of the champion and all of that stuff, North Carolina was wiping the floor with Baylor. 13 of 35 from the 3-point line against Marquette, along with 52 rebounds in that game for North Carolina. We know North Carolina is going to rebound. That's their whole premise of the program is rebound, get extra, don't give up extra possessions, get extra possessions. Very next game against Baylor, 11 of 25. So 44% shooting the 3 and 47 rebounds. If North Carolina is going to morph into this team that shoots 40% from the 3-point line and racks up 50 rebounds a game, then the jam is done. North Carolina is going to win the title. But what's more likely, that they have morphed into this team or that they found a nice arena that they liked playing in for a weekend and they liked a matchup? The reason we liked North Carolina against Baylor is because we liked the matchup, right? Baylor having suffered some injuries, right? Jonathan Chamo-Chachua not being in the lineup. That's going to be a problem for a guy like Armando Bacot, or I should say it's great news for Armando Bacot, but for guarding Armando Bacot, that's going to be a problem. And guess who was really good in that game? Armando Bacot, all right? And a couple other defensive matchups. It's obviously not the Baylor of past. The metrics look good defensively for Baylor, but they are still going to play you at a sort of above average pace, right? Their guards are going to get up and down the floor here. North Carolina is going to do the same thing. And so we go, okay, if they're playing North Carolina's game, then I like North Carolina to potentially win this game, especially at a value of plus 200, plus 250-ish, somewhere in between there. I forget what the price was. I think it was closer to plus 200 against Baylor. Here's the thing. We just talked about with UCLA, what type of game do they play? They play at a more controlled pace. They play the grimy Mick Cronin style of basketball, right? Where it's you're going to get a contested shot, right? You are not going to get those open threes. You're going to get a contested shot. You're going to get contested rebounds. You're going to get, the Bruins crashing the offensive glass. You're going to get the Bruins playing sort of this relatively conservative style where it's okay, we're going to play you 54-50. We're not going to play you 74-70. And so I look at a game against Marquette being man, that's actually a really great matchup for North Carolina, but it is North Carolina. They could screw it up. And then I look at it, oh man, circle that one, Baylor against North Carolina. But then whether it was going to be St. Mary's or UCLA, 2 teams that will run sort of pristine basketball, both defensively and offensively. That's going to be problematic for UNC. And so this is sort of very similar to the Houston thing where it's I had this pegged. I'm not going to get overly excited by what I saw from North Carolina because of 2 good matchups in a hot shooting weekend. We talk about Arkansas and college kids. Is it going to turn from one weekend to the next and how often it does? I think that could be the case in a negative way here for North Carolina as they, in the South region, what region is this? The East region. In the East region, right, they're going from relatively comfortable shooting environment here to now going to be a little bit rougher to get a, open shot. with UCLA. So I don't know that I'm looking to wait any longer here. I do want to know more about Jacquez, because if he's out and this line goes to -1, I think that matters, but it's going to be built into the point spread, because if I think the point spread should be 3 or 4 and Jacquez is out and it goes down to 1, then I don't have to worry about the Jacquez thing because it's already been built into the point spread. So I just kind of want to know more about what the deal is with him. And I almost kind of shouldn't say it this way, but I kind of prefer -1 or even pick him without Jacquez than I do -3 or -4 with him in. You know what I mean? Because I think UCLA still wins the game without him. I just, obviously I'd rather not have to lay the points, but I will lay the points here. I will figure out the right market time. Keep your ear to the ground here when it comes to Jacquez. Matchup wise, we mentioned Bacot. One final thing here. Cody Riley and Miles Johnson basically never play together. It's funny how their minutes literally add up to 40. Sometimes you'll get overlap where it's like Zach Edey plays, 25 minutes and so does Travion Williams, because sometimes they play together and like it rarely looks all that great. Mick Cronin's like, no, these two guys are never going to see the court at the same time. But the point is Miles Johnson, who plays, I think 16 minutes or so, he only plays 16 minutes or so because Cody Riley is on the team. So if Cody Riley got into foul trouble, for example, guarding Bacot, they have another guy who can play 20 to 25 minutes. He just doesn't based on circumstance. Whereas on the flip side, if Bacot gets into foul trouble, well, what's the other option? Right? There kind of isn't one, because you've seen McCoy come in for North Carolina, and whether it was him having to play against Duke when Bacot got in foul trouble in the first half, and you watch that game, and again, whether it was that game against Duke or whether it was the game where he had to come in and play because of all the foul trouble against Baylor, you're sitting there going like, this is not the game for this gentleman. This guy cannot play in this game in an effective way. UCLA doesn't have that issue. North Carolina might have that issue where they have to spell Bacot for even a couple of minutes. I don't like that when it comes to him dealing with Cody Riley and then Miles Johnson and never getting that break, right? Never getting the backup center in sort of, obviously Miles Johnson's a backup center in name only, but he certainly wasn't at Rutgers last year when they were this close to beating Houston and advancing, but I digress. So again, I think tough matchup here from stylistic and personnel wise here for North Carolina. The really only question mark is going to be where our market entry is, whether that's going to be -1 or something better if Jacquez gets ruled out. Doesn't seem like he's going to be ruled out. So maybe 2.5 is going to be the play that we're just going to have to make here on UCLA.
And to wrap things up here, we got the 11 seeded Iowa State, a 10 seed Miami. Just amazing when you see two double-digit seeds going at it. But Miami favored by 2.5 points here. They're both riding high, obviously, winning the 2 games, making it into the second weekend. But how do you see this game matching up here? Because I kind of want to ride with Iowa State in the points here, but I'm not confident in it, to be honest.
I think the latter part of that statement is really more exciting than the former part of the statement, right? Mm-hmm. It's more, I rather just take the points than I rather bet on Iowa State. Like, I know those two things are congruent, but like, I just want the points in this game. And at 2.5, I think that's too many points. Frankly, my number is Iowa State -1. And it comes back to the idea that like Baylor, obviously, leading the way in the Big 12 conference and having that effort in the end against North Carolina, Kansas advancing, TCU having the effort against Arizona. Like, the list of Big 12 teams that have played really well is really long. And like Iowa State being one of those teams. And it's funny, right? Like, your bracket looks all sexy when you've got the double-digit matchup of UAB Chattanooga or Richmond and South Dakota State. Meanwhile, like, in reality, the double-digit matchup is pretty good team that at one point was 12-0, I think, in the Big 12, Iowa State, or from the Big 12, I should say, in Iowa State, and Miami, who at one point led the ACC this year, had a road win against Duke. Like, these two teams are double-digit seeds only because we ran out of seeds, not because that they are some like upstart program here. Now, Iowa State can feel like an upstart program, obviously a new coach in TJ Otzelberger. And listen, if I ride on South Dakota State for never actually winning in the tournament, it's hard to get that excited about TJ Otzelberger here. And as much as people give credit to Jim Larrañaga, he's pulled it off again. It's like, yeah, I mean, you won by 2 against USC when USC was just like handing you the ball the entire game. And then, yeah, like you beat Auburn. But again, I kind of felt like a lot of teams were going to beat Auburn. And now they get a ton of credit and they're up to 2.5 point favorites here in a game that I think at the very least is a pick 'em. And now, unlike some of these other 2.5 point spreads here, particularly Arizona and Houston, where I go, okay, I don't really care for the points because I don't think Arizona wins this game by 1 point. If they win it, it's going to be by 3, 4, 10, whatever. This is one where I could see it landing Miami by 1, Miami by 2, like a relatively high percentage of the time, because Iowa State's going to grime this game up, right? I think the total might be even a little bit too high at 132.5, because I think this game is going to get super grimy and points are going to make, a lot more of a difference. They're going to matter more here. So I think this is also, again, it's just a different game for Miami. Like, Iowa State's not going to play you the same way USC is, because they're not going to turn the ball over a trillion times. They are not going to jack shots. They're not going to try, crazy plays. They're going to get into a gap and they're going to take a short jumper. And they have guys who can make that, right? Gabe Kalsher's obviously making some 3-pointers, but Isaiah Brockington is my guy when it comes to like a bucket getter type of a dude. When it comes to late game type situations, he is going to have the ball in his hand. Whether he makes the shot or not is probably going to decide whether Iowa State wins or loses this game. But I think it comes down to that last shot. And when I look at Miami, I'm trying to figure out who that guy is on the team. Now, maybe it's Cameron McGusty, maybe it's Charlie Moore, but it feels like he is more, should be more of a distributor type of role situation. Isaiah Wong looked great against Auburn. There are days where Isaiah Wong looks like he's not really familiar with how basketball works, right? It's a lot of turnovers and get messy. I just look at this and I go, okay, like Iowa State feels like the more consistent expectation here from how they're going to play, whereas Miami, capable, right? And that's the idea, capable of beating USC, capable of beating Auburn, capable of beating Duke at Cameron, but honestly also capable of losing to Syracuse. And there was, wasn't that long ago that they went to Syracuse and they ended up pulling the game out because Syracuse gave it away in epic fashion. But Syracuse was winning that game by double digits, right? They had a close game with Syracuse earlier on in the season. They've had other losses. You can go down the list and be like, man, that's kind of a shady loss. That's just where we're at with this Miami team, right? And they're playing really well, and it's why we liked them last week against Auburn, but we also liked USC against Auburn. We just basically hated Auburn. So again, I'm not going to go wild here and think that they should be favored. Now, again, could they win this game? This could be a buzzer beater 3 to win by 3, and we end up losing. This could be Miami winning comfortably here because the sort of, the fairy dust runs off on Iowa State, but I don't think it's fairy dust. I just think it's like, maybe they could have more talent on the team and they'll eventually build that talent back up from a team that was 2 and whatever last year. Part of that is bringing in a guy like Isaiah Brockington, right? This isn't the same group that only won 2 games last year. So yeah, I mean, do I love Iowa State in sort of an Iowa State type of a way? Or do I love this game in I'm getting plus 2.5 points of a way? It's definitely the latter here. So give me the 2.5 points with Iowa State. I don't think they necessarily need to win for you to win this bet, unlike a few others in the Sweet 16.
Yeah, definitely. It's a weird one. And there's still time for me to talk myself into Miami, if I'm being totally honest. But it's a very weird matchup. It's a very weird matchup for sure. And as we wrap up that Sweet 16 there, the tough part now is we got to wait to see the next time that we'll talk, and we'll be able to break down those games, because the messed up part about how this works from the gambling perspective is that who knows what happens in these Sweet 16 games. Right? Like, yeah, we could be talking about so many different matchups that's going forward that it just makes me so excited to watch these games and move on to the next round after that. But my dude, if people wanted to catch up with you, figure out some lines, figure out what your thoughts are post these Sweet 16 matchups, where would they be able to do that?
Yeah, at MRuss Authentic on Twitter. I can do some quick projections here. We'll see where it sort of lands, but I'll give out the picks for any picks that I have for the Elite Eight when it happens. But think of it this way, right? Gonzaga, I have about 4 points better than either Duke or Texas Tech. Some of these are relatively easy because I have Texas Tech and Duke rated equally. And so I think Gonzaga's got about 4 points on either of those teams. So we'll see what the point spread is. Anything less than 4 on Gonzaga, and even 4, to be honest with you, barring obviously injuries, that sort of thing, against either one of those teams, I'm going to be on Gonzaga in those games. Houston, Arizona, right? Like 2 teams that we have rated really equally. Just because the point spread happens to be 2 doesn't mean I don't have them rated equally. Let's assume it's Villanova here. Again, I think we both think that they're the most likely team to win this game, even if we may or may not be on opposite sides of the point spread. Houston should be about a 3-point favorite against Villanova. I would actually lean to take the points there if it was anything higher than that. Maybe Houston gets a little too much credit against Arizona, and maybe we end up with a Houston, 3.5, 4 type situation. If it's Michigan, not complicated here either, right? We talked about how Michigan and Villanova are about a 4-point difference. So now we're talking about like a 7-point difference between whomever they face, right? And again, I use Houston as an example, but Arizona, if they win that game, right? I have Arizona -3 to Villanova. I have Arizona -7 to Michigan. The Kansas thing, right? Same sort of deal. Kansas is going, if they win, again, heavily favored, most likely, opponent. Iowa State and Miami have them rated the same. I have Kansas about -7 in that game. The funny thing here, right, is Providence as the 4 seed is rated at the exact same level as Iowa State and Miami, right? They are all sort of in that, within a basically less than a point of each other. Of course, Providence is the 4 seed and those other teams are 10 and 11. So when I say they just kind of ran out of seeds, that's what I mean. They just kind of ran out of seeds. So I would expect Kansas to be about the same price. That'll be an interesting matchup. Is it Iowa State, obviously a team they're familiar with in the Big 12, or is it a sort of new team, so to speak, in Miami? And then finally, Purdue and UCLA, obviously the 2 teams that are most likely to get out of their game. I have those teams rated equally. So again, I'm expecting a pick'em game in that situation. Hopefully we get a point or 2 maybe with UCLA. Obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, but I would be riding with UCLA against Purdue in that game. If it ends up being North Carolina, now we got ourselves a bit of a different situation. We're going to be getting points with North Carolina. And if it's North Carolina, it probably means that they're still shooting. They're still shooting really well. And they're a team that, again, theoretically, just from a program standpoint, right, all the rebounds, they should be able to compete with Purdue. But again, we'll deal with that all on the social media this weekend, which is at @MRussAuthentic on Twitter.
Well, the madness continues for yet another week, and hopefully it's more sweet than sour in the Sweet 16 as we're coming up on some more madness action. My dude, thanks as always for plugging in with us. Greatly appreciate it.
Appreciate you back, my friend.
Thanks to Matt for coming on the pod. And if you want to follow me online, you can do so on Instagram at Sheldon Alexander and on Twitter at Shell Alexander. Don't forget to like and subscribe to DRF Sports Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Also rate us, review us, like us, all that other fun stuff. But for more from this new project from DRF Sports, just a little reminder. If you're unfamiliar with the letters DRF, it stands for Daily Racing Forum, which has been around for over 100 years, giving you all of the horse racing information, data, and analysis. But now we've taken over the entire sports world. So if you want coverage on every football game, as well as the NBA, MLB, college sports, and more, head to drf.com/sports for all of the details and insights, as the site has all of the data on every game, including offensive and defensive stats, betting angles, line movements, key injuries, team stats, and more. The DRF data is what powers our power trends. So if you want to see which trends our analysts have selected, follow us on Instagram and on Twitter. If you want access to all of the raw data, drf.com/sports. That's where you can find the usual previews as we deep dive into the games. And of course, we got you covered on this podcast. However you want your betting information, we've got you covered. Again, my name is Sheldon Alexander. That's all I got for now. But until next time, see ya.
Thanks for listening to the DRF Sports Podcast. Please subscribe, rate, and review the show. For more sports betting advice, go to drf.com/sports and follow on Twitter at DRF_sports.